What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Gsluke here with a little course breakdown for the Hero World Challenge, our last real PGA event of the year. The first one, feels like in forever here with the week off last week. Did play a little bit of prize picks on the Euro Tour side, but back at it with our bread and butter. Smaller field event, just around 20 players, but you're still talking about the world's best teeing it up. If you make it to this event, you're one of the premier players on all of the PGA Tour, so it should be competitive. You're going to see some low scores around this track, a scoring average better than 2.5 shots under par, but a lot to break down. Sure, it's a resort style golf course, that's Albany, but it still has its niche, its little tricks of the trade that you need around the venue. One that has 5 par 5s, but is over 7,400 yards. So it's, like I said, it's got its little tricks to it. That's what we're going to cover on this video. Everything you need to know about this week's golf course to get your week started for the betting and the DFS side. We're going to go through all of the specifics, length of the golf course, designer, some of my favorite key stats for this week, also my comp courses around the PGA Tour that play similar to this track, and even a hole-by-hole analysis of Albany to really give you an idea of what these players are going to be facing. So by the end, the goal is that you'll have all of the information that you need for your research process to start to consider who you may bet for an outright, who you might want to play in DFS, because with only 20 players to choose from, you're going to have to pick your spots, right? If you're somebody that typically bets 6 to 10 players on your outright card, you're probably looking at maybe 2, 3 at the very most this week. Or for somebody like me, probably just betting one outright. So it's definitely a different week when it comes to your analysis. Have to be a little bit more top heavy. Obviously, it's a lot of the top end players, but it opens up a lot of solid betting numbers for guys that we might typically find at 10 or 11 to 1 in the swing season that are closer to 25 or 30 to 1 in this sort of field. So a lot to look forward to. Let's go ahead and hop on in. All right, Albany Golf Club. Not really Albany Golf Club. It's just called Albany, but I mean, we've got to call it something, right? So maybe the golf course Albany. I don't know. We're just going to call it Albany from here on out. But it's in Nassau, Bahamas, outside of New Providence in terms of a city. And it's a resort style golf course, but not your cookie cutter resort style course, right? You're not talking about a shorter track. I mean, this is over a 7,400 yard golf course. It's also a par 72 with 5 par 3s and 5 par 5s. So it's got a lot of things working on it. I mean, it's a risk reward golf course. A lot of the par 3s are a little bit lengthier, so they bring a lot of difficult iron shots into play. A few of the tee shots on the par 5s are over water. It's where you see some of the thickest natural areas where there's actual marshes as opposed to just sand in between holes. It's well designed. So though it's made for your everyday golfer, you and me, to go out there and enjoy, it has a few aspects to it, like even undulating fairways. I mean, they just have these little nuanced effects around this track that keep it from being taken to 4 or 5 under par every single round, because with those 5 par 5s, extremely receptive greens down there in the Bahamas, that part of the world, you're going to see scoring, particularly when it's the top 20 players in the world, like what you have with the field here in the Bahamas this week. So it's, it has a few defenses, which we'll go through, when we go through each aspect, but it's still going to get taken apart, right? You have those 5 par 5s, so that's why the scoring average was 2.52 shots under par. A lot of that was because of the extra par 5 on property. Water is only in play on 5 holes. There's only 3 water hazards on the entire property, so water's not the real thing to worry about off the tee. It is the natural areas, and at this golf course, the rough is pretty much non-existent. It's just a slight border between where you have the fairways and then these natural areas, where kind of like with a seaside course, some of these desert style golf courses that you might see on the west coast of the United States, so certainly not in the Bahamas, have a lot of these sandy natural areas in between holes. And at Albany, you have that same sort of effect. So it's hard to really encapsulate how that affects play, but at a lot of, TPC Scottsdale is one of these desert sort of golf courses. A Shriners Children's Open is another one of those sort of golf courses. You can miss off the tee, so you don't have to be an elite accuracy guy, but you can't be one of the most inaccurate players on tour. You can't be a sprayer off the tee. Jordan Spieth gets into a lot of trouble at desert-style golf courses. But Ricky Fowler, though, I mean, when he was in his prime, going out there, winning there at Scottsdale, contending in a lot of those, American Express sort of events where you have a desert sort of golf course, he wasn't missing it too far offline left to right. He was one of the straighter drivers of the golf ball. You're looking for players that aren't necessarily elite accuracy guys, but can at least keep it on planet Earth, right? So like a Jordan Spieth is rolled out in that sort of argument, right? He's going to miss 40, 50 yards offline at times. You're looking at a John Rahm, right? He doesn't miss very often, and when he misses, it's not very far from the center of the green, or at least the edge of the fairway when he's hitting it into the rough. Justin Thomas, right? He misses quite often, pretty largely from left to right. Those sort of players, you might want to be a little bit careful about this week. So though it is a resort-style course, it does have those sort of defenses going for it. Yeah, I mentioned Ernie Els' design. That was also in conjunction with a Tiger Woods. So a little bit of a co-design there, a little bit of influence on the course. And I think that's where you see these undulating fairways. So they're not drastic like you get at an Augusta National. We're going to have a lot of elevation change too. There's not any elevation change on this property, but you do have some undulations in the fairways, which can complicate your lie, right? You can have a shot that's, hanging above you where you're going to hit a draw bias. You can have one that's below your feet where you're going to end up hitting a fade, so on and so forth. You're going to see a lot of those sort of shots mixed in, and that's where the creativity factor comes in. So Jordan Spieth, right off the tee, is not going to fare very well because of his misses, but he's also an extremely creative player. So when he's hitting it in the fairway, maybe that's a little bit of a boost to his sort of play. But that's, again, kind of hard to encapsulate because we don't see those sort of fairways very often. We see it at Kapalua for the Tournament of Champions. We see it here. We see it at Augusta National. We saw it at the CJ Cup. Congaree Golf Club had extremely contoured fairways. So it's not something we see very often on tour, so it's hard to really look at it stat-wise. But for specific players, like a Tiger Woods, extremely creative, or Jordan Spieth, might be something to consider there. There are 5 holes with water in play, but 52 bunkers on property, and a lot of those are natural areas, so not truly bunkers. A lot of the sand that you see in between holes is characterized there. In terms of actual bunkers, there's about, I believe, 40 on property, so a good amount of them. Most of them are greenside. The fairways are large, massive. They're not quite the aircraft carriers that we saw for the RSM Classic at the Plantation course, but they are relatively large landing areas. They do differ in size. There's a few that are tight, so I do have to mention that. A few tee shots, particularly with the angles that you're forced to hit at, can be a little bit narrower than you'd like. But most of the time when you're missing, even in the natural areas, it's not all that much trouble, but there are a few areas that you can't miss in. Most notably, there are, the 3 water hazards that I talked about, but also a few really thick natural areas that players are just going to have to X out on their yardage books, right? Just under no means get into that. You saw Bryson DeChambeau get into that kind of trouble a lot last year. Jordan Spieth also got into trouble a lot off the tee in those sort of areas last year, but most players were able to stay clear of it, right? You exit out for a reason. You make sure that you don't hit it over there, and you're going to have just a fine round off the tee. Most of it's wide open. Again, even when you're missing the fairway, a lot of times you're just going to be in a sandy area and not have too much trouble getting to the green. And like I said, they are 419 Bermuda, so it's going to be Bermuda from tip to toe around this track. It is a 419 Bermuda in the fairways and the rough. The rough is pretty much non-existent. I say quote-unquote rough here because it's right about a yard wide, and it's only about ½ an inch long, so it's not even that much longer than the fairway. It's more aesthetic than anything to kind of create that border between the fairway and the natural area, and it's that same strain of Bermuda grass. The greens, though, are where you get a defense here. So we have the undulation in the fairways, but the greens are only 4,500 square foot per green. So 4,500 is right about 2,500 square foot less than the average. They are a Tiff Eagle Bermuda grass, and with tiny targets, you would think that around the green would be extremely important, but that's not really the case because the around the green shots here are unbelievably easy. You have shaved off fairway areas, greens that are running slow that are also extremely flat. So despite all the undulation you have in the fairways, the greens are about as flat as you're going to get. I mean, it is a resort style course. You have to remember they're not trying to make this, tour difficult for the people that are playing there day to day. So you're looking at extremely straightforward shots, not a lot of downhill shots to worry about. They're running at like 10.5, 11 on the stint meter. And though we don't have an official reading from the PGA Tour, from the eye test, they look to be running extremely slow last year. You saw plenty of holeouts, players that were getting up and down from seemingly everywhere. I mean, even short-sighted guys like Tony Finau are getting up and down all day. I mean, Victor Hovland won here, and we know that Victor Hovland has one of the worst around the green plays, around the green games on all of the PGA Tour. So if he can win at this sort of track, it's probably not the most important stat that we're looking at. So that, fits the eye test. Also, the Victor Hovland test when it comes to the golf course. Another track that's like that is over there at Mayakoba. He's won there. He's had a lot of success at courses where you have a relatively simple around the green play. So that shouldn't be that much of a surprise. And if you look at some of the winners, like a Bubba Watson at this golf course, he fits that same sort of build. So you're looking at just trying to hit greens rather than missing them. If you miss them, you're probably going to get up and down. But to take it to a 25 under par like a Bubba Watson took it to, you're going to have to go nuclear all 4 days. You're going to have to set up birdie look after birdie look. And if the wind kicks up, that's the one real defense here that we have to talk about now before we go hole by hole. Is this place, if it doesn't kick up, you're going to see like 20 to 25 under par wind. If it does, something like 17 to 18 under par like we saw last year. It wasn't a massive factor for Thursday through Saturday, but on Sunday last year, the wind really did kick up. You had quite a few rounds into the plus there. Obviously, Victor Hovland was able to keep it under par. That's why he ended up winning. That only happens when you get 20 to 25 mile-an-hour winds. This golf course isn't a true coastal course. It's about a mile inland. It's kind of like the Plantation course there with the RSM in Sea Island, where, I was there on property. The Plantation course, there was hardly any wind at all. The scoring average was like 2.5 under par the first day. The scoring average on the Seaside course was hardly under par because there was, about a 10 to 15 mile-an-hour breeze. And it's not like geographically, there was a difference in the winds from one direction to the other. Just one was completely exposed. The wind just sweeps across the landscape. The other one had trees on it and diffused the wind. You're going to have that sort of effect for some of the holes around Albany, and some of them are going to be exposed because when we go hole by hole, you'll see, a lot of it's just natural areas in between where sand, little brushes that aren't going to protect players from the wind. So it's a little bit more of a nuanced factor here. If the wind kicks up, though it's inland, you are going to see an effect, but not quite the effect that you'll see for a coastal course, right? Like the Seaside course over there for Kiawah Island, Pebble Beach, for example, any actual course on the coast. Harbor Town, right, has a lot of holes that are actually on the coast. It's a completely different story, right? It's going to be running about 10, 15 mile an hour higher over there on the actual coast. But if we get nasty weather, you're going to see that at the Albany course. So it's something that we have to consider. The scoring average on Sunday was a solid 2 shots harder than it was for the first 3 days. So if we're going to get nasty weather the entire weekend, then we might want to start considering around the green play a little bit more, right? Players that have played well historically in windy conditions, but until we get that sort of weather forecast, it's hard to say. But as of right now, one thing's for certain, it's something that we're going to have to keep an eye on. All right, we've got Pro Visualizer up, and we're going to go quickly hole by hole to give you an idea of what these players are facing. So hole number 1, a 453-yard par 4. You can see it's slightly tilted from left to right. The undulations, you're not going to get a great perspective or great appreciation for them with some of these overhead views, but you do have a relatively large landing area. I want to point that out. And then these natural areas, right? So this is what I'm talking about. There's a few areas you absolutely can't miss, where it's dense shrubbery, and we can see that there on the overhead look. You don't want to be on that, right? You're going to be hacking out sideways, maybe taking it unplayable. But if you're over here in the landing zone where there's just small little bushes, most of the time, right? Like I'd say like 80% of the time, you're going to be just fine. You're going to have like 170 yards into the green, which isn't ideal out of that sort of lie, out of that sort of grainy surface, but you can get the job done. You can get it up there green side. And with how simple these green complexes are, getting up and down is not a problem. You can see how small they are, right? It's a little strange shape there, kind of blending in because the overhead views aren't the best, but there's not really a pin location unless they're extremely tucked to the side and you're short-sided. That's going to cause you that much of an issue. When they're running at 10.5, 11 on the stimp meter, when they're as flat as they're going to be, and when it's fairway for most of the way around the green, you're not going to have problem applying spin to the ball. And when they're running that slow, these players are going to be borderline making most of their around the green shots. So that's really, giving you a good gist of this golf course. But hole 2, 188 yards, a par 3. You can see relatively small surface there too. Hole 3 is your first par 5. It's 579, and this is where the tee shots can get a little bit dicey, right? You can see the angle here isn't ideal, particularly from the set of tees that the pros are playing from, and it really chokes off here at like 280 yards. So you got to get it out there with a 300-yard carry, and the longer you are, the more straightforward the tee shot is, right? You can avoid this choke point, cut off a lot of the distance of this par 5. So this is where you start to see the advantage as a bomber, but you got to keep it in play, right? If you're hitting it in the natural area, 270 yards out of the shrubs, out of, the sandy area, isn't going to be doable. Whereas in the fairway, that's a pretty simple 3-wood or even a 5-wood for a lot of these players, an iron for somebody like a Bryson here last year. So it's a scoreable course. Off the tee is going to be a huge factor. Even on these par 4s, right, that are nearly 500 yards, it's going to be a huge help to be both long and accurate off the tee. This is the largest fairway I think I've seen on Pro Visualizer. It looks like it's literally a football field wide. So get it out there with all of your might, and you're left with about 200 yards into a tiny green, but it's so straightforward around the green that it's just not a difficult hole. It's going to play like right around even par. If it's super windy, maybe it plays slightly over par, but not nearly like half a stroke or a stroke over par like you might see at other golf courses. Next up, we got hole number 5, 175 yards. It's a tiny green. You can see it's, cantered, I should say maybe just shaped in a little bit of an oblong shape from bottom left to top right. So it's a little bit awkward. Some of the back right pin locations can be tricky. Even like a back middle pin location is tricky just given how narrow this green is. But again, if you can just hit this green with your irons, if you're one of the more accurate iron players on tour, no matter where they put this pin, you're going to have at most like a 25-foot putt. So just definitely a ball striker's course, and that's pretty much in every single green, right? At most, you're going to have like a 30, maybe 35-foot putt, which means if you're hitting greens, if you're keeping yourself in play, ball striking it, it doesn't really matter how good of a putter you are, right? You should be able to take advantage of it. Next up, we got another par 5. This one is 600 yards, so a little bit more difficult to reach in 2. I believe only Bryson was able to reach this one in 2 last year, and he's not in the field this time around. A little bit more of a reasonable distance for tour players. It's probably over here to the right, like 306. Some of your bombers can probably get it out there like an extra 10, 15 yards. So let's put it at 320. That's going to leave you 268 into the green, and that's over a natural area for almost the entire shot. So that's why a lot of players will lay up to the right. Most of the players on tour were able to get it up here just in front of the green, and it's only this one green here. So you can see it's a double complex. That's actually for the other hole over there, that little portion. So it's not truly a double green. I guess they could use the other side if they wanted to, but a lot of times the pin location was up here in the front. You saw Jordan Spieth, Justin Thomas end up chipping in there last year. And even a back left pin location, if you're laying up here to the right, you have the entire green to work with. So it's definitely a birdie look, but not a lot of players are going to have eagle looks there unless you're chipping in. Next up is the drivable par 4. You did see quite a few players get it up near the surface. Not a lot of guys laid up. If you do end up laying up into one of these bunkers, it leaves you one of the hardest shots in golf. It's a 60-yard sand shot into the left. I believe it's like a 65-yard, 70-yard sand shot into the green. Those are some of the more difficult shots on all of the PGA Tour. So a lot of players, you kind of have to make a decision if you're like a shorter driver. This is 270. So if you just hit driver, everyone in this field can clear it, right? So you just take that shot out of play, be a little bit more aggressive, because if you end up in one of the greenside bunkers, it's an extremely easy up and down for birdie, right? Whereas if you're one of these, 60-yard shots here, it's no guarantee that you're going to hit the green. You're looking at just getting up and down for par. I think that most guys are just going to take that out of play. Hole 8 is 211 yards, so it's a longer par 3, a little bit of a larger green than some of the other ones. So yeah, just pretty straightforward. Just, get it on the surface, 2-putt. Because of how small the greens are, you might be looking at a birdie look though. Hole 9 is 606 yards, another longer par 5. This one played downwind last year, so I believe a few players were able to get it on the green in 2. But most of the field will lay up to the left and leave just a little flip shot onto the green to try and make a birdie. Colin Morikawa was able to take advantage of these short iron shots last year. That's why he was able to play well through the first 3 days. Kind of fell apart there on Sunday, as a lot of players did in the windy conditions. But there's a couple different ways to get it done, right? You can be the bomber that reaches into, or you can be that player that just hits it into the layup zone and hits those flip wedges to 4 or 5 feet, right? There's different ways to take it to, 18, 19 under par, and you'll see that with the leaderboard. It's not just going to be all bombers or all players that are accurate on approach. It's going to be a pretty diverse group, I would imagine. Next up, we got hole number 10, 435 yards. It's pretty run-of-the-mill. It's got a wide fairway. You don't want to miss left in that fairway bunker, and one of the larger greens on property. So it's a little bit of a handshake. If they were starting at hole number 10, I think a lot of players would appreciate that. One of the easier holes on property. Hole 11 is a par 5, 589 yards. I would expect most players to try and take the bunker out of play, hit a driver. What is the carry here? 303 yards. That's more than doable for the field. There's not a lot of shrubs to worry about off the tee unless you're missing way to the right. Bryson ended up missing over there last year. I believe Jordan Spieth too ended up derailing both of their rounds early. If you miss to the left, you should have no issue at all getting to the green, but get it in the short stuff, and you've got 270, 260 into the surface, which is no problem for these guys. Next up, we got a 200-yard par 3. So got a little bit of water to the left, which is more just for the aesthetic than anything. It's not really in play unless they use the back left pin location. Pretty run-of-the-mill par 3 there. Next up, you got a 470-yard par 4. This tee shot is one of the more narrow fairways that we have on this golf course. You can see it really chokes up around the sand hazard here. This is about a 3-wood distance here, so in theory, you could just try and hit a driver. It's actually a little bit wider up here. You can see you get that little bit of extra fairway to the right side. So I would expect a lot of players to start it down the left, try and fade it, with a driver into that gap there, because that's the largest landing area that you're going to have, and that's right in that little fade gap for a lot of these longer players. Actually, not even for the longer players, just for pretty much every player in the field. So I would expect that to be the tee shot du jour. If you're a drawer of the golf ball, I mean, it's not a really good look for you. We're going to have to start it over the bunker there and try to draw it into the fairway. Yeah, most guys are probably going to hit a fade there. Pretty simple par 4. Next up, you got another drivable par 4. A lot of players will go for this one too. Again, I think there's more risk in laying up because if you end up in one of the natural areas, you're left with that like 60, 70 yard sand shot, and there are shrubs in this area too. So you can end up a little bit unlucky, be forced to lay up, that sort of thing. If you take driver, the carry to get it over the stuff is 280, so you can do that with a 3-wood. If you're hitting driver, I mean, you're easily getting it onto the surface. So, I mean, even if it's super wet, super receptive out there, I would expect most players to be able to get it on the surface. Definitely a birdie hole for most players. Next up, we've got another par 5. It's 547, so the shortest of all the par 5s, reachable in 2 for the entire field, probably for you and me out there if you were playing on this golf course. Definitely for me, probably for you too. Yeah, no one's going to lay up. Everyone's going to go for this in 2, and I expect a lot of eagles on hole 15. Hole 16 is 484. It's a relatively difficult tee shot. If you're a bomber though, right? If you can carry it like 300 yards, you widen up a little bit past the sandy area. I would expect a lot of players to hit driver here to try and take this bunker out of play, which is, I believe, about a 290 carry. Yeah, right about 290 yards. Takes this bunker out of play. So it opens up the stuff to the left and the stuff to the right. But you'd much rather be closer to the green in a fairway bunker than, back here, only hitting it 280 off the tee with a 3-wood and left with, let's see, what's the distance? Like 200 yards out of a fairway bunker. I mean, that's got bogey written all over it. Whereas, if you miss to the left over here, you're left with 171. As long as you're not in your bush, you're fine. You miss to the right, same story, actually a little bit less distance. You're probably at like 169 there. That's a completely reasonable par. So I think the longer players are certainly at an advantage on this golf course, and I think the more aggressive players are going to be rewarded. You got your last par 3 here, 180 yards. The water's just more visual than anything, not really in play. And lastly, we've got hole 18, which is 468. The water is in play here. I love this. It's really the only hole on property where there's water in play. Water the whole way down the left. The areas to the right have a lot of shrubs in it, particularly in your driver landing zone. So you got to nut up here and hit a good tee shot. Your approach does go over the water. If you end up hitting a hook, you're going to be in the agua, but it's 180 yards unless it's super windy. I mean, the bailout spot's to the right, I guess. So you hit a draw just off the right side of the screen, and you try and draw it onto the surface. I would expect most players to take that sort of avenue and it's not as difficult as it looks. I'll just say that, because you have all that room to the right. I mean, if you hit it short right, you hit the draw a little bit, it goes straight. You're in this little chipping hollow, super easy up and down. Even if you're in that sandy area to the right side of the green, it's just not that difficult of a shot, unless you're in a bush, right? There's always that opportunity at a desert style golf course, and I always call this like a desert style golf course. It's just because of the natural areas. We saw it at Congaree, right? That's not in the desert, but all of the courses over there on the west coast kind of have this aspect to it. These players are used to that at this point. If it was you or me, right, it'd be an absolute, nightmare to try and get up and down from there. But it's not nearly as difficult for these tour players. So yeah, that's an idea of the golf course. And hole 18, though you could run into trouble off the tee to the left, it's not nearly as difficult a closing hole as you see for most of these courses on the tour. Now that we've seen the golf course, let's go ahead and talk through our key metrics for analysis that I'll be using to identify my top golfers of the week. So at number 1, we've got shots gained approach. Good old reliable, bread and butter for us golf analysis nerds. But most importantly, with 4,500 square foot greens, you got to keep yourself on the surface. And when you do, you're going to be rewarded with a ton of birdie looks. Because they're so small, you're looking at like a 25, maybe a 30-foot putt at the very most on these surfaces, and they're relatively flat too, running at like 10.5, 11 on the stimp meter. That means that players can be a little bit more aggressive than usual, and if you're an elite level iron guy, hitting 15, 16 plus greens regulation per round, there's no reason you shouldn't shoot something like 7 or 8 under par. And that's what you saw last year, particularly when conditions were lower winds than what you had there on Sunday. So that's something that I'm looking at. It's the most sticky stat from week to week, the most consistent stat that we have here in the PGA Tour. When the players get on, heaters with their irons, they typically are able to carry that for at least a month, maybe a month and a half at a time. So no brainer, something that we're always looking at, and definitely the case here for Albany. Next up, we've got birdie or better percentage. At a golf course with a winning score between 18, maybe 25 under par, like Bubba had back there, I believe 5 years ago, you're going to have to score. You're going to have to take this place to 5, 6 under par pretty much every single day. With 5 par 5s, that's reasonable. You have at least 2 drivable par 4s, if not 1 to 2 more for some of the elite distance players. It's a risk-reward golf course that's going to favor the bold. So we've seen that in the past. A lot of the players that have succeeded here have been some of the more aggressive players on tour. Victor Hovland fits in that bill, Bubba Watson. A lot of the winners between those two have also fit that same sort of criteria. So definitely something that I'm looking at, and especially for the fantasy side. For Draftkings, for FanDuel, if you're playing over there for fantasy, birdies, eagles, birdie streaks, all are the name of the game when it comes to winning those GPPs, having top-end fantasy score upside. So it always should be something that you're looking at on that front. Next up, we've got shots gained putting on Bermuda grass. So with a birdie fest, with a course where it's going to be a resort-style, flat-greened golf course, putting is typically going to be important. But one thing to note is that a lot of the winners haven't necessarily been elite-level putters. So that's why it's down there at number 3. Most of the time, putting should probably be your number 2 key stat. So you might even argue that this week it's slightly less important than it is for most golf courses. So it's still there in the top 3, but a few other key stats you might want to consider would be driving distance, hole by hole. That should have been apparent when we, went through some of the dog legs, a lot of the traps, a lot of the drivable par 4s that you can take advantage of. The longer you are off the tee will be an advantage this week. Looking at par 5 scoring with the extra par 5, shots gained around the green, though they are simple around the green shots, you don't ideally want to be bleeding shots around the green. So, a Victor Hovland one, don't hold it against people too much here, but having a solid around the green play would help. I mean, especially for some of those par 5s. Looking at shots gained at no-cut events, that just kind of brings in some of this stuff you can't characterize about a no-cut event, right? Motivation, maybe it's just familiarity with the play style, being able to play, quote-unquote, more freely when you don't have to worry about a cut line. That's a good way to encapsulate all of that narrative BS, right? So me, I always try to stick by the numbers if I can. That's how I do so. Just look at some of the other no-cut events and who's played well there. I know it's a smaller field, right? It's only 20 players as opposed to 60 for a lot of the other ones, but there's a lot of parallels that can be made. Looking at shots gained at desert golf, which is any course, and I mentioned I call this a desert-style golf course, yet it's in the tropics, it's in the Bahamas, so clearly it's not actually in a desert. It's the desert style of golf, right? Where you have all of those hazards in between holes, sandy areas, natural areas. There's a whole set of golf courses on the PGA Tour that I classify that as. The one at Congaree Golf Club for the CJ Cup also fits that description despite being in South Carolina. Those sort of golf courses, who's played well there, who's able to keep themselves in play is another golf sort of metric I'm looking at. And then shots gained at comp courses. Of course, the tracks around the PGA Tour that I expect to play similar, not just from the desert golf side, but from all the other factors that I'm considering is a huge factor in my pool and something that we'll get to right now. With our comp courses, at number 1, we've got Congaree Golf Club. So I've mentioned it a few times. It's another one of those, natural area golf courses where you have the sand dunes in between holes. Also, a lot of undulation on the fairways, and it's a quote-unquote like resort style course. It's not really meant for tour pros. Over there at Congaree, it's actually meant as more of like an educational tool. It's more of like giving back to a community sort of tool that they're doing over there in Ridgeland. This golf course was also not designed for tour play, yet it still has a lot of the undulations to it in the fairways, Bermuda grass from tip to toe. It's got greens that are relatively flat, despite all of the other, geography around it being so undulating. There's a lot of similarities that can be made there, and both are relatively long golf courses. So a lot of the things that we're looking for in terms of driving distance, shots gained putting on Bermuda, of course, shots gained approach is always a key stat for these golf courses, are similarities and things that I would expect to have a lot of correlation between the leaderboards. And though we don't have a massive sample size, a few guys that have popped at both tracks have played well over the years, both at Albany and at Congaree. And something we'll have to track over the years. We'll have to see if that sort of trend continues. But if so, could be an even better comp than I'm giving it credit for right now. So still my number 1 comp, but might be an even better comp than we expect because, with the small sample size, definitely a few guys that have popped across both tracks. Next, we got TPC Scottsdale, the stadium course. That's the home of the Waste Management Phoenix Open. Another track where you have quite a bit of room off the tee, but when you miss, you're in the natural area. You're in the desert. It's up to luck at that point. So guys like a Jordan Spieth that miss it wildly off the tee have tended to have a little bit of inconsistent results. Now, they've had a few top end finishes. I remember a few years ago, Jordan Spieth's coming out party was him almost winning the Waste Management Phoenix Open. But a lot of times he has a piss poor performance there, and it's because of that style of golf. So when you're looking at Scottsdale, it has that going for it, kind of like a Congaree. Also, undulating fairways. They also have greens that are relatively small around TPC Scottsdale, or at least that play small. They have, sections to them. Some of them are extremely large surfaces, but because of some of the undulations to them, they play as smaller, little tiered surfaces where you have to hit the right tier to truly have a putt at birdie. So there's a few comps that can be made. And when you look at the leaderboard, so we have a relatively large sample size for TPC Scottsdale. You see a lot of the players that aren't so good around the green, but are elite iron players, have success at the Waste Management, and that's exactly what I'm looking for this week. So that's why I'm taking a look at it as one of my comps, and it's there at number 2. And at number 3, we've got the Innisbrook Resort Copperhead course, so the home of the Valspar Championship. It's from the eye test, doesn't look the same at all. You're not dealing with natural areas like you have with Congaree or over there at TPC Scottsdale. But elite drivers of the golf ball and elite iron players have a lot of success around that track. And that's kind of what we're looking at this week. I mentioned it's a resort style course, but it has a lot of difficulty with the ball striking. And at, Copperhead, that's exactly what you get. It's a long course. It's a resort style course, Innisbrook Resort. I've played there before. The greens aren't all that bad. Now, they run them a little bit faster for tournament play there than usual, but we have a massive sample size, just like we have at Scottsdale, and a lot of elite level iron players that have had success. So, your Sam Burns of the world, right? That's an elite level iron player. Off the tee is really solid in terms of his distances, has success at Innisbrook. I would expect him to have success at Congaree over the years, and I think he's going to have a lot of success at this sort of golf course. So, he's probably your poster child for, a course fit this week. His around the green play is a little bit shoddy from time to time, but everything else he's checking off as, top 5, top 10 player in this field. So if you're looking for, a player archetype this week, it's probably a Sam Burns. But Innisbrook, great comp. Same thing with Scottsdale and Congaree. But a few honorable mentions, I guess, would be Vedanta Vallarta, the home of the Mexico Open last year. Just not a large enough sample size to use it for my analysis. Also looking at TPC Twin Cities, course with relatively small greens. Easy golf course with a couple other parallels that can be made there too. The Sea Island Seaside course, of course, you have the natural areas in between greens. It's a shorter course, a lot more wedges in hand than you're going to have here, but it does have that going for it. And lastly, PGA West, the stadium course. So the main course in rotation at the American Express, where they play 2 out of the 4 rounds. That course has some water in play. It's a desert style course where you have the desert areas in between holes. So it has that going for it. But most of all with PGA West, flat greens. It's a resort style course. PGA West is meant for like you and me to play, right? Not really tour pros. The American Express, I believe Siwoo Kim won at like 27 under par, routinely gets to like 18 to 25 under par, which is exactly what we get this week. So that's 7 courses for you. Obviously the top 3 I'm considering a little bit more, but Vedanta Vallarta, TPC Twin Cities, Sea Island, Seaside, and the PGA West Stadium are also perhaps worth taking a few looks at. All right, fellas, that is all I've got for this week's course breakdown. Before you hop on out of here, go ahead and smash that like button. Also subscribe if you haven't already so you don't miss any of the content in the future. But hopefully now you feel a little bit more prepared for this week, whether you're placing outright bets, entering some DFS lineups, whatever you're doing for this golf tournament, a little bit more about the golf course. That's always the aim here, and hopefully you enjoy the architecture standpoint. In the future, I'm hoping to get better overhead views, potentially try and partner with some sort of company to do so, potentially even with a company on the media side to try and do more in-depth course breakdowns, maybe in person for some of these golf courses. Something I'm working on. I go to a lot of these golf tournaments. I'm gonna start trying to put that into, I guess, content version going forward, right? Trying to document it a little bit more. There's a lot more coming from the course breakdown perspective. Perhaps walkthroughs on the practice rounds. You have to get, media rights from the tour to go out there and do so. But a lot of stuff that I'm exploring and I'm going to explore now that we have a few weeks off, right? This is the last tour event until the Century Tournament of Champions that I'll be covering here on YouTube. So I'll be taking a little bit of a break there, but if you have any ideas for me, right, from the course breakdown perspective, feel free to go ahead and fire away. When I was at the Live Golf event, I actually met a fan from Peru that gave me a few ideas about, tweaks that I could make to some of my course breakdowns, and something that I'm probably going to do here for my next set here for the Century Tournament of Champions. So if you have any ideas yourself, feel free to go ahead and fire them down below. But as per usual, guys, I appreciate all the support here. You guys sticking to the end, hitting the like button like you guys do for all these videos. And until next time, best of luck with all of your fantasy or bets for this week. And I'll catch you guys for our core picks video a little bit later on this evening.